In the winter of 1923, a peculiar phenomenon swept through the cafes of Berlin. A customer would sit down and order a cup of coffee priced at 5,000 marks. By the time they finished the cup, the waiter would inform them that the price had risen to 8,000 marks. If they ordered a second cup, it might cost 14,000. This was not a business trying to price gouge. It was a desperate attempt to keep up with a currency that was evaporating in real time. People began to pay for their meals before they ate them, terrified that the price would double between the appetizer and the dessert. This is the image we all know of the Weimar Republic, the wheelbarrows of cash, the children using bundles of banknotes as building blocks, the women burning money in the stove because it was cheaper than buying wood. We look back at these grainy black and white photos and to ourselves that it was a unique historical madness, perfect storm of war operations and stupidity that could never happen in a modern, sophisticated economy like the United States. Like you strip away the sepia tone and look at the mechanics of what actually happened in 1923, the parallels to the American economy, the 2020s, are not just uncomfortable, they're precise. The hyperinflation of Weimar Germany was not caused by a mysterious act of God. It was the result of a specific set of policy choices that are almost identical to the ones made by the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Congress over the last 5 years. We are not yet at the wheelbarrow stage. We have entered the Harveststein phase, the period of delusion where the central bank believes that printing money is the only way to save the economy, unaware they're pouring gasoline on a house fire. To understand the present, we must autopsy the past. Germany in 1921 was a wounded giant. It had lost World War I and was saddled with the Treaty of Versailles, which demanded massive reparations payments to the Allies. These debts were denominated in gold marks, meaning Germany couldn't just print paper to pay them. They had to earn foreign currency or gold. This crushed the German budget. But the real catalyst to the collapse, the patient zero event, was not the debt itself, but the Ruhr crisis. In January 1923, French and Belgian troops invaded the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland, because Germany had defaulted on a shipment of telephone poles and coal. The Ruhr was the engine of the German economy, producing the vast majority of its coal and steel. The German government, unable to fight back militarily, ordered a policy of passive resistance. They told the workers in the Ruhr, "Do not work for the French. Stay home. Strike." But those workers still needed to eat, so the German government made a decision. "We'll pay your full wages to stay home and do nothing." This is the exact equation that triggered hyperinflation. Massive price strike, massive demand stimulus, and production rate hike. Coal, steel, machinery collapsed. If the factories were closed, the supply of real things vanished. Simultaneously, the supply of money exploded because the government was printing fresh marks to pay millions of people to sit on their couches. When you have fewer goods chasing much more money, prices do not just rise, they go vertical. Is this unfamiliar? In 2020, the United States government responded to the COVID-19 pandemic with the exact same logic. They shut down the economy, factories closed, ports idled, and services stopped. The supply of goods and services collapsed. The supply shock. Simultaneously, through the CARES Act and subsequent stimulus bills, they mailed trillions of dollars in checks to people and businesses to keep them solvent while they didn't work. The Federal Reserve printed money to buy the government bonds that funded these checks, the demand stimulus. We recreated the Ruhr crisis on a global scale. We paid people to consume, but forbade them to produce. For a brief moment, it felt like magic. Savings accounts swelled, stock prices soared, people felt rich. But in Germany, the initial euphoria of 1922, where export businesses boomed due to the weak currency, quickly turned into the nightmare of 1923. The lag between the printing of the money and the rise in prices is the wily kayaking. You run off the cliff and for a few seconds you hover in midair, defying gray. You think the laws of physics don't apply you. Then you look down. The tragedy of Weimar of personified by Rudolf Hyperinflation, the preen to the Reichsbeing, the train theory. Hyperinflation was no villain. He was a serious suit-wearing technocrat who believed he was doing his duty. When prices started to rise, businesses screamed that they didn't have cash to pay their workers or buy raw materials. They claimed there was a shortage of money. Hyperinflation listened. He believes it was the central bank's job to provide liquidity to keep commerce flowing. So he printed more money to help businesses pay the higher price. caused businesses to rise further, which led businesses to demand even more money. Havenstein famously argued that the inflation was not caused by his printing press, but by speculators, hoarders, and the foreign exchange rate caused by foreign enemies. He suffered from monetary cognitive dissonance. He slunset the fireman behind more, me was actually the arsonist moneyed fewer. We hear the echoes of Havenstein in the speeches of modern central bankers. When inflation first spate in 2021, we were told it was transitory. We were told it was caused by supply chain bottlenecks, just as Havenstein blamed the ruler blockade. We were told it was Putin's price hike, just as Havenstein blamed the French. We were told it was corporate greed, just as Havenstein blamed Jewish speculators. The excuses never change. The authorities will blame the weather, the geopolitics, the unions, or the corporations. They will blame anything and everything except the one thing they control, the money supply. The mechanism that finally destroyed a German mark was the commercial bill. Private companies write IOUs, bills, to each other. The Reichsbank allowed these companies to bring the IOUs to the central bank and exchange them for flush cash at a very low interest rate. This meant that private debt was being monetized. If a German corporation wanted to buy a competitor or speculate on the stock market, they could effectively print the money to do it with the blessing of the state. This is functionally identical to the Federal Reserve's quantitative easing and its backstopping of the corporate bond market. By keeping interest rates artificially low while inflation raged, the Reichsbank encouraged everyone to borrow. If inflation's 100% and the interest rate is 5%, you're a fool if you don't borrow every cent you can. You take the loan, buy a factory or farm, wait a month and pay back the loan with worthless paper, keeping the real asset for free. This creates a crack-up boom. The stock market soars in nominal terms. The rich who have access to credit loot the real wealth of the nation. The middle class who have savings in cash are wiped out. By the summer of 1923, the psychological dam broke. The German people realized that the government had no plan to stop. They realized that the mark was no longer a store of value. It was a lie. This is the Weimar Germany. It was not a specific number on the inflation chart. It is a phase change in human behavior. It is the moment when you get your paycheck and literally run to the grocery store to spend immediately because you know who buy less tomorrow. It is the moment when the velocity of money goes to infinity. The U.S. has not hit this velocity. The dollar has stood seven, the cracks in dem visible. And people still hoarding gold at Costco when they start putting their savings into Bitcoin as a bond. When they start buying houses they can't afford just to get out of Kaji, they are intuitively sensing the Havenstein trap. To know deep down that the debt is unpayable and that the only way out is the printing press. In 1923, the illusion lasted until the money died. In the 2020s, the illusion is bigger, the debt is larger, and the fall will be from a much greater height. While the printing press was the engine of the disaster, the fuel that burned down German society was a phenomenon that economists call the Cantillon effect, but which the average German simply called the Fed. Inflation does not affect everyone equally. It is a mechanism of redistribution. It transfers wealth from the creditor to the debtor, from the prudent saver to the reckless gambler, and from the working poor to the asset-holding elite. In 1923, this dynamic birthed a new class of ultra-wealthy oligarchs who became known as the Ropicus. It transfers. They are the men who understood that when money is done, debt is the path to godlord. The avatar of this new age, with Hugo Stinis, he was the inflation king of Weimar Germany. While millions of Germans were starving, Stinis became the wealthiest man in Europe. His strategy was brutally simple and perfectly legal. He saw that the Reichsbank was keeping interest rates at 5% or 10%, while the inflation rate was rocketing to 500%, 1,000%, and eventually millions of percent. This meant the real interest rate was massively nin. The bank was effectively paying him to borrow money. So Stinis borrowed everything he could. He took out massive loans in marks and immediately used the paper cash to buy real assets, coal mines, steel mills, newspapers, hotels, and ships. He built a conglomerate that controlled nearly 20% of German industry. A month later, when the loans came due, he would pay the bank back with worthless paper money that he acquired by selling just a tiny fraction of his production. He essentially bought the entire industrial base of Germany for free. He looted the nation with the permission of the central bank. This is the historical mirror of the financialization of the American economy. Over the last decade, we've seen private equity firms and hedge funds borrow billions at near zero interest rate to buy single-family homes, veterinary clinics, and dental practices. The sinus. These cheap rent to cancel real assets. The average American saving their wages in a bank account paying 0.01% interest was the victim of this transfer. Their purchasing power was diluted to fund the acquisitions of the asset class. The K-shaped recovery we talk, let's say, where the stock market hits all-time highs while food banks see record lines, is the classics symptom of a late-stage inflationary boom. It creates a society where work is punished and speculation is rewarded. The most tragic casualty of this dynamic was the German middle class, the Mittelstand. These were the people who played by the rules. They were the civil servants, the university professors, the doctors, and the pensioners who had beautifully bought government war bonds and saved for their old age. They believed in the stability of the state. In 1923, their entire life's work was vaporized. A bond that had been purchased in 1914 for 10,000 marks, enough to buy a comfortable house, was worth the price of a tram ticket by a summer of 1923. Is a famous story of a German widow who sold her large family home in early 1923, intending to move to a smaller apartment and live on the difference. By the time the paperwork for the sale cleared a few weeks later, the proceeds were barely enough to buy a pair of shoes. She had not just lost her house, she had lost her survival. This destruction, the middle class, is the most dangerous consequence of inflation because the middle class is the keeper of the social contract. They're the ones who uphold the law, support democracy, and believe in the future. Where you strip them of their sayings, you strip them of their allegiance to the system. They stop believing in order because order has betrayed them. This betrayal triggered a psychological phenomenon known as the flight into real vice. Holding cash was suicide, so they bought anything. They got pianos they couldn't play. They bought antique rugs they didn't need. They bought sops of coal, scrap metal, and foreign currencies. The velocity of spending became frantic. This is what modern economists who doom spending. We see staying here of American Gen Z in Wales. They're spending record amounts on luxury, goods, travel, and experiences. They have no savings and no home equity. The meme presents them for being irresponsible. Their behavior is rational in an inflationary environment. If you believe the house is permanently out of reach and that your savings will be worth less next year, why save? You might as well enjoy the sushi and the trip to Bali today. It is a form of financial nihilism born from the realization that the traditional path to wealth, save, invest, compound, is broken. As the currency collapsed, a German stock market entered a manic hallucinations phase. The Berlin Bourse became the center of national life. Everyone became a day trader. Waiters, stable boys, and housewives crowded into the bucket shops to bet on stocks. Nominally, the stock market soared. The index went from thousands to millions to billions, and if you looked at the chart, it looked like the greatest bull market in history. But in real terms, priced in gold, dollars, the stock market was collapsing. The properties were earning worthless paper. Their factories are deteriorating. But the money illusion kept the party going. This mirrors the everything battle of 2021, where meme stocks, cryptocurrencies, and NFTs trade at absurd valuations. And one that GameStop with a great company, without there was too much money sloshing around with nowhere to go. The market ceased to be a mechanism to party gari and began casino for liquidity extortion. But the rot went deeper than just economics. It destroyed the morality of the nation. In his memoirs of the period, the writer Stefan Zweig described how Berlin transformed into the Babylon of the world. If his work no longer paid, wages couldn't keep with prices. People turned to crime, prostitution is swindling just right. The values of thrift and honesty were mocked. The clever people were the black marketeers who sold stolen meat and markup. The fools were the people who worked a 9-to-5 job. Berlin became a city of extreme decadence and extreme poverty. The bars and cabarets were full of foreign tourists and inflation profiteers popping champagne, while disabled war veterans begged in the gutters outside. It was the era of cabaret, but without the Hollywood gloss. It was a desperate hedonistic dance on the edge of a volcano. This moral disintegration is the final stage of the Weimar moment. When a society loses its unit of account, money, it eventually loses its unit of value to morality. If the government can steal your labor by printing money, why shouldn't you steal from your neighbor? The contract between the citizen and the state is broken. All other contracts become negotiable. By the autumn of 1923, the breakdown was total. Farmers refused to ship food to the cities because they didn't want the worthless paper money. Starvation riots broke out in Berlin and Munich. The passive resistance in the ruler had failed. The printing press was running 24 hours a day, employing thousands of people just to stamp the numbers on the bills. Yet there was still a shortage of camps because prices were rising faster than the ink could dry. The system had reached its mathematical limit. The velocity of money had hit the wall. The stage was set for the final collapse, the introduction of a new currency, and the rise of the political extremists who had promised to restore order at any cost. The Weimar moment teaches us that hyperinflation is not just an economic event, it is a trauma. It leaves a scar on the national psyche that lasts for generations. It destroys the trust that binds the civilizations together. And once that trust is gone, the door is open for monsters. By November 1923, the mathematics of the German economy had crossed into the realm of the surreal. The exchange rate, which had been 4.2 marks to the dollar in 1914, hit 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. A single egg cost 80 billion marks. A newspaper cost 200 billion. The printing presses of the Reichsbank were no longer sufficient to feed the beast. Private companies, municipalities, and railroad stations began printing their own emergency money, note gilt, on scraps of leather, wool, and silk, just to have a medium of the stains. The country had reverted to a primitive state of barter. Farmers would only trade potatoes for a piang or a gold ring. The complex industrial division of labor, which requires a stable unit of account to function, had disintegrated. Germany was a modern nation with medieval economics. It was in this chaotic vacuum on November 8 to 9, 1923, at the absolute zenith of the Hyperinflation, that a then obscure agitator named Adolf Hitler launched his beer hall putsch in Munich. This is the historical correlation as often missed. The Nazis did not rise to power during the Great Depression. They were born in the hyperinflation. It was the total destruction of the middle class's faith in the democratic state that gave Hitler his first audience. He screamed that the system was rigged, that the November criminals in Berlin had stolen the people's savings, and for millions of destitute Germans, his rage felt like the only rational response to an insane world. The inflation did not just encrypt the country, it radicalized it. Then, as quickly as the fever broke, the patient stabilized. The miracle occurred on November 15, 1923. The government, led by the newly appointed currency commissioner, Yellar Schacht, introduced a new currency, the rent mark. The genius of the rent mark was not financial, it was psychological. Germany had no gold left to back a new currency. It had no foreign reserves, so Schacht created a fiction. He declared that the new rent mark was backed by a theoretical mortgage on all the agricultural and industrial land in Germany. It was a land currency. In reality, you could not actually take a Rentenmark note to a bank and exchange it for a patch of soil in Bavaria. The backing was illiquid and largely symbolic. But the German people, desperate for stability, chose to believe the lie. They were tired of the chaos. The government set the exchange rate, 1 rent after 1 trillion paper marks. Overnight, the zeros were deleted. Schacht strictly limited the supply of the new currency. When the government came to him asking for more money to pay bills, he said no. He forced the state to balance its budget or shut down. The miracle of the rent mark worked. Prices stabilized within dates. The wheelbarrows disappeared. The cafes went back to selling coffee for pennies. The stabilization revealed the true horror of what had happened. This is the 0-hour stone for wealth. When the smoke cleared, the winners and losers were frozen in place. The winners were the debtors, the industrial tycoons like Stinis, the farmers with mortgages, and the government itself had wiped out trillions worth of debt for the price of the postage stamp. The German state had effectively liquidated its domestic wealth. The losers were the seers. The middle class looked at their bank accounts. A lifetime of savings which might have been 1,000,000 marks, a fortune in 1914, was now converted to $0 due rent marks. They had literally nothing. The stabilization did not bring their money back. It just confirmed that it was gone forever. This true decade of bitter legal and political warfare, known as the revaluation controversy. Millions of angry savers sued the government and the banks. They argued, You cannot just wipe us out. We demand that our savings be revalued to reflect their original gold worth. The courts were paralyzed. If they ruled in favor of the savers, they would bankrupt the corporations in the state all over again. In the end, the government offered a pittance, a revaluation of roughly 15 to 25% for certain mortgages, but almost nothing for government bonds. The message was clear. In a crisis, the creditor dies so the debtor can live. The state will always prioritize the survival of the institutions, the banks, the corporations, the government, over the rights of the individual saver. The lesson for the modern American is terrifyingly simple. We are moving toward our own rent-and-mark moment. The U.S. national debt of $36 trillion and rising is mathematically unpayable in real dollars. There were only two ways to clear the ledger. One is a jubilee, the chaotic collapse when the debt is defaulted on. The other is a reset, a managed transition to a new system where the debt is inflated away and then redenominated. We are already seeing the architecture of this new system. It is the central bank digital currency, CBDC. Just as the rent mark was sold as the solution to the chaos of the paper mark, the digital dollar will be sold as the solution to the coming crisis of the fiat dollar. But they will tell you it is stale, efficient, and secure. They might even offer a conversion rate, perhaps 10 old dollars for one new digital dollar. But in that conversion, the purchasing power you lost during the inflation will not be returned. It will be locked in as the new baseline. The theft will be formalized. The history of 1923 teaches us that the only people who survived with their wealth intact were those who exited the system before the door closed. They were the ones who held gold. Gold did not go up in Weimar Germany. Gold simply stayed still while the paper world collapsed around it. An ounce of gold bought a suit in 1913, and it bought the same suit or a city block in 1923. They were the ones who held productive land or foreign currency. Though in a global fiat crisis, no paper currency is truly safe today. In the 21st century, we have a new asset class, Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the digital equivalent to the gold the German savers wished they had. It is an asset with a fixed supply that cannot be diluted by a central banker like Havenstein or politician like Schacht. It is the only asset that is truly outside the banking system. In 1923, you had to physically hide gold coins in your mattress or bury them in the garden to protect them from confiscation, which became a real threat. Today, you can memorize a 12-word seed phrase and carry your wealth in your head across words in your printing press. The Weimar moment is not a prophecy of doom. It is a prophecy of consequences. Economics has laws just like physics. You cannot print prosperity. You cannot borrow your way out of debt. Eventually, the bill comes due. For the last 50 years, America has enjoyed the exorbitant privilege of the world's reserve currency. We have exported our inflation to China and Japan. We have lived beyond our means, but the privilege is ending. The inflation is coming home. The velocity of money is turning. The trust is freeing. And somewhere in the corridors of the Federal Reserve, a modern Havenstein is looking at the data, convinced that just a little more liquidity will fix the problem. He is wrong. The wheel is already turning. The only question left is when the music stops, will you be holding the paper or will you be holding the rock?